Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about one of the most famous choral works in the history of Western music. I'm referring to Allegri's Miserere. I mean, it's so famous we don't even care about Allegri's first name. In case you're interested, it was Gregorio. That was his name, Gregorio Allegri. Talk about a one-shot wonder. I mean, nobody cares about anything else that Allegri wrote except the Miserere. And the fascinating thing about it is that the one we sing isn't even actually the way he wrote it, believe it or not, but a later amplification of what he wrote. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk about what a miserere is, because that's Latin. I mean, those of you who are choral singers already know probably. But what the miserere is the complete Psalm 51. The entire thing. It's one of the great penitential psalms. The text is penitential. It's very, very penitential. It's have mercy on me, God, wash away my sins. I've only sinned against you. You're the only one who can wash them away. You know how it goes. It's that stuff, and it goes on for quite a while. And it's sung during Holy Week, at the climax of Holy Week, in the darkened church, just like Haydn's The Seven Last Words. There were lots of reasons to blow out the candles and darken the church. And this was one of them. And at the end of the service, where everyone's kneeling and it's all in darkness, they would sing Allegri's Miserere. And this was a precious possession of the Sistine Chapel Choir back in the day. Allegri probably wrote it in the 1630s or thereabouts. And the Sistine Chapel Choir jealously guarded it and refused to let anyone else have the version that they used. And as a result of that, the story goes, the 14-year-old Mozart, around 1770, was visiting Rome, snuck in there for the appropriate service, and then copied the whole thing down from memory. He supposedly showed up possibly one more time to make some corrections, and that's how it escaped from the clutches of the Vatican, although apparently there were other copies in circulation by then. But the reason the Vatican's version was so important is because what Allegri's setting is really very simple. It's based on the Gregorian chant of that particular psalm. And what happens is it's written for a 9-part choir divided into 2 parts. The 2 parts are 2 sopranos, an alto, a tenor, and a bass, and then 2 sopranos, an alto, and a tenor, or an alto and a bass without the tenor. I think that's what it is. It doesn't make any difference. It's 9 parts. And what happens is the first choir sings a bit of it in a very chant-like way. Then there's some actual chant from the tenors. And then the other choir sings a response. And that's the response that has the part, the money part, which has the high C's. And so you usually separate the second choir from the first choir, so they're in the distance, and it's very atmospheric. I mean, the atmosphere is really part of the piece. And those high C's, which were not written by Allegri, only came later, but that's the way the piece was transmitted to us, at least as Mozart copied it, and later Mendelssohn made a copy of it, and there were a bunch of composers who copied and diddled the thing. And then there's some more chant, and then the whole thing repeats itself. So it's chorus 1, chant, chorus 2, chant. That's the basic unit. And each verse of the psalm is set that way, and you hear it 5 times until at the very end, the 2 choirs come together for the conclusion. The whole thing plays for around 10 to 12 minutes, and would actually be rather dull were it not for the fact that it's sung in what's called falso bordone. Now, falso bordone, is of course one of the 12 ritual pasta shapes that are served at dinner during Holy Week. I'm just kidding. That's not true. Falso bordone is a way of harmonizing Gregorian chant. And what made the Sistine Chapel's version so effective was the fact that the singers of the chapel could ornament the melodic line on top in various ways as they sang it to make the music more interesting and more thrilling as it went. And no one is entirely sure exactly what they did, But there have been various reconstructions. We're going to talk about that as we go. So that's what makes the music interesting. And like I said, the money part, the part with the floating high seas in the distance coming from the far end of the church, all of that was added later. And since Berni, actually, let me get to that. Mozart copied the thing down in 1770, right? He gave it to the British music historian and scholar Charles Berni, who toured all over Europe writing about music. His books are wonderful, by the way. They're absolutely worth reading. Berni promptly published the thing in England, and ever since then, the Miserere has been a special feature of English choirs. And that's how it sort of escaped into the world. There are innumerable recordings of the Miserere, and the best one, frankly, I'm going to tell you right now, absolutely the best one, is the Tallis Scholars. The Tallis Scholars has made a career of doing the Allegri Miserere. They've recorded it something like 3 or 4 times. Well, 3 times in different recordings. They did it live in Rome. They did it in the Sistine Chapel. And I just want to play you a little bit of their version of it, because here's the choir with the wonderful floating high seas that have made the piece such a popular hit as a choral work. So take a listen just to this one verse. All right, now that was a one way to do that particular type of music. But because the Tallis Scholars have been doing it so often, one of them, Deborah Roberts here, who is a fantastic chorister and soprano with a perfect voice for this kind of music, developed some embellishments to that vocal line, which she added in their later recording of the Miserere, which is this one. This is on the disc called Music for the Sistine Chapel. And on this particular disc, I'm going to play basically the same music, just that, one fabulous soaring line. And you can hear how she ornaments the line, and you get a sense of what may have been done actually in the Sistine Chapel at the time. You see, and it's that kind of treatment that makes the music interesting. So as far as recordings of the Miserere go, which one you get depends on what you want the couplings to be. As I said, my choice is the Tallis Scholars, and my choice is actually the very first recording that they made, which is, to me, unforgettably atmospheric and incredibly gorgeous. And that comes, as do so many recordings of the Miserere, with Palestrina's Pope Marcellus Mass. Now, the Pope Marcellus Mass has its own story with it. That's the piece that Palestrina supposedly wrote for the Council of Trent to prove that polyphony, multi-voiced music, should not be banned from the Catholic service in favor of just straight Gregorian chant, because the church fathers, who actually cared that people heard the words and knew what they meant, even though most people probably didn't speak Latin. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense. The whole story doesn't make a lot of sense. But apparently the Council of Trent wanted the words to be audible, whether people would have understood them or not, even though they were all in Latin. And so they wanted to ban complicated music, and Palestrina showed by writing the Pope Marcellus Mass for Pope Marcellus, that the music didn't have to be that complicated, even though modern scholarship now holds that it was composed before the Council of Trent, so we don't really know. It makes a great coupling to Allegri's Miserere, which from a discographic point of view is the only thing you need to know. And it's on this absolutely, oh, there it is, I have the cover here, fantastic disc, coupled with a British choral work, William Mundy's Vox Patris Celestis, or Celestis, if you want to pronounce it that way, which is amazing. It's a setting of words from the Song of Songs, and it's glorious. 20 minutes of amazing polyphony where the words don't matter. It's amazing, and they sing it fabulously. So this is really, I think, the recording of the Miserere to get if you're having only one. But if you want to hear what else the Tallis Scholars have done with it, there's their music. These booklets are going to kill me. Their music from the Sistine Chapel collection, which has two versions of the Miserere, two versions, the standard version plus the version ornamented by Deborah Roberts quite beautifully. And you also get another Pope Marcellus Mass, and you also get Palestrina's Stabat Mater, in case you don't have enough. So there's that. And they also did a version live from the Sistine Chapel in Rome. So you can just OD on the Tallis Scholars doing the Miserere alone. But I'm going to just talk to you about a few other recordings that I have sitting here, because I got a pile of them. And what's going to determine the one that you get will have something to do with the couplings. I expect one of the most famous, although I don't think it's anywhere near the best anymore, was King's College Choir with David Wilcox. Pardon the glare on these things, but I'm not taking all these booklets out. This contains Palestrina's Stabat Mater also, and a Magnificat, and the Litany of the Virgin Mary, and a couple of motets. But what makes this one sort of special in its day, when it was released in 1963, is that the version of the Miserere is in English, which some of you may want, and the boy soprano is Roy Goodman, who later became famous as the conductor of the Hanover Band. But in those days, he was a boy soprano, and here he is belting out the high C's. So that's one way to do it. And then there are just a bunch of them by other English choirs. I mean, we've got the choir of St. John's College, Cambridge, led by George Guest. You've got the Miserere, you've got the Missa Super Bella Amphitrite Altera by Lassus. Remember Lassus? Lassus, who gave us the Sibylline prophecies? It's gorgeous. Lassus is great. And Veni Sponsa Christi, a different Palestrina Mass. So, I mean, Palestrina only wrote 100 of them, so, there are 106, I think. It's sort of the same as the amount of Haydn symphonies. So there. And then there's, of course, the Naxos version with the Oxford Camerata and the Schola Cantorum of Oxford with Jeremy Summerlee. This gives you the Pope Marcellus Mass and another Palestrina Mass, Missa Aeterna Christi Munera, and the Stabat Mater and the Miserere. So there you got that one. Then, of course, we have the choir of Westminster Abbey under Simon Preston. Here you have the Pope Marcellus Mass, the Miserere, and then some other pieces by people you probably haven't heard of, like Felice Anerio and Giovanni Bernardino Nannino and Ruggiero Giovanelli, doing shorter choral works. This was one of these originals. It was a DG Archive release, and it's quite lovely. And let's see what else. Now, here's an interesting one. This is not English. Believe it or not, it's not English. This is on Astray. And what makes this disc so interesting, and I'm even going to take the booklet out so you can see it, is that it has actually other music by Allegri. Because, no one plays anything or does anything, sings anything by Allegri. This contains the Miserere in two versions. The Baroque version, which is the one that we're used to, and then a possible reconstruction of the original version as it might have been done by the Sistine Chapel Choir, again, similar to what the Tallis Scholars did. And here you get the Missa Vidi Turba Magnam, and then three motets, all by Miserere, by Allegri. I mean, you might as well call him Miserere because that's the only piece anyone cares about. But this is an actual Allegri disc. I don't know of many others, to be honest with you. And I think this is even out of print. I mean, Astray doesn't really exist anymore, but I wanted to show it to you just to let you know that, he exists as a composer who wrote other things besides the Miserere, and someone actually made a record of Allegri's music. Gregorio, good for him. And then finally, as part of the sort of Renaissance English specialist school of performance, there's this excellent version on coro with the 16. And this gives you also, oh, look, it's the Pope Marcellus Mass, along with a wonderful Crucifixus by Lotti. Remember Lotti? We talked about him too. Lotti was the guy who Bononcini plagiarized in Handel's day. He was a transitional composer between sort of the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation and the Baroque period. And he was around in Handel's day. And, he's very interesting. So you get the Palestrina Stabat Mater and Lotti's Crucifixus and the Miserere and the Pope Marcellus Mass, all done superbly by the 16 on coro. So that's basically the story with Allegri's Miserere. I return and will close just by saying once again that my own preference, my real preference, is the Tallis Scholars. They are absolutely wonderful. This was one of their first recordings, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful disc. Not just for the Allegri, but really for the William Mundy piece, the Vox Patris Celestis. Wow, that's a knockout. I mean, English choral music from this period is stunning. It has these high floating treble parts, and it's amazing. And of course, the Pope Marcellus Mass, which is Palestrina's most famous. It's probably the most famous mass setting in the history of Western music, along with the Allegri being the most famous non-mass setting in the history of Western music. However you do it, you can't go wrong. It's a wonderfully evocative and beautiful piece, and those who have sung it know it's a joy to sing and perform. I mean, if you can get the right room and make it nice and atmospheric like it's supposed to be, and it's a treasure. It really is. And I think the fact that it has not existed in a single stable form throughout its history is sort of a testament to the living tradition of performing this music. And it's a wonderful tradition, a beautiful tradition, and it's one that lives on to this day. So keep on listening, folks, to Allegri's Miserere, however you find it, and whatever version floats your boat. It's a knockout. Take care. Thank you.